which is thanks, Galen. I always forget to do that too, right at the beginning. All right, so what's underneath the strategy and objectives in green, what shows up in the A20 plan are how it relates to equity. And what it says here is allowing and promoting ADUs, which are accessory dwelling units. So those are units units that would be over a garage that people are interested in putting in, and that would provide more housing options and help homeowners rent out portions of their home to help with costs of living. The other item that's on here is increasing mixed use zoning, which will help create a mix of uses and housing styles that provide just more opportunity for living spaces for members of the community. So here are two books, jumping into, to the topic. Here are two books that have had a strong influence over me in recent years. I've been exploring this issue since I've become a planner. Just a side note about me, I have a degree also in social work. So I come at planning from a perspective that's really about people. My focus is on trying to make life better for people, basically. And I think this that our surroundings, the environment that we live in, really has a huge impact on our ability to fulfill ourselves, to live a fulfilling life. So I really have been researching ways to create a more equitable environment for people. And in recent years, these are the two writings that have really captured my attention. The first one is Our Kids, The American Dream in Crisis by Robert Putnam. And then the second one is The Color of Law, so Richard Rothstein. So if you haven't had a chance to read these, or if you don't know about these, I do encourage you to check them out if you can. There are summaries of them available online too. So if you're like me and have a hard time sitting through an entire book, there are summaries that you can go to get more detail than what I'm going to provide tonight. But just to give you the general overview, starting with the first one, Our Kids, The American Dream in Crisis. The basic premise of this is that the American dream is even further out of reach than it was decades ago. And that is due to the income gap increasing. We have a wider gap between those who have money and those who do not. In wealthy areas, which are typically white areas, have more access, basically. They have more access to space, better schools, and increased safety. And schools is a really important thing because that's starting with children, at the ground level, and what opportunities are presented to people. Schools in wealthy areas just basically have more resources and can connect students with more mentors and people in power. And I think that last point is really important, that there's just more connections for people in wealthier areas. And then youth are experiencing distressing conditions in general. Actually, that's just true all around. Youth are just experiencing more trauma than ever before, but this is especially acute in lower income areas. And that just impacts everything about you. So people, and especially youth in low income areas, are just being hit with trauma after trauma, and that can be on a personal level, but it's also happening on a community-wide level. Now, The Color of Law, so this gets into how our government segregated America. So the premise of this book is that segregation happened along racial lines and that this was not done by accident, that this was a product of government action. And so what his book goes into is redlining. So redlining, this is probably a term that many of you are familiar with, but this was a really institutionalized way of segregating. So this started during the New Deal era. And this was the Homeowners Loan Corporation, then the Federal Housing Administration, and then the Veterans Administration. So three major institutions that dealt with housing back then adopted the system of color coding maps to determine where it was safe to insure mortgages, what was perceived as being safe to insure mortgages, what would be a good investment. So anywhere where African Americans lived were colored red to indicate that these were not safe places to insure mortgages. Now, racial covenants, I'm not going to go into this much because we're going to be talking about this a lot more, but this was another tool that was used. And then zoning. So zoning in the past had explicitly zoned out minorities. This was declared unconstitutional, but it still is practiced through zoning out unwanted elements. So this is kind of still in practice today. So zoning can really play an impact of on who belongs in a community and who doesn't. So there's some argument that people will bring up that the Fair Housing Act in 1968 removed all legal barriers, and it did on paper, but it's really hard, you know, when there's several different starting points for people. So it's very, very difficult to break into the middle class, and it's getting further and further out of reach, as Putnam puts forward in his book, that the gap is just growing wider and wider. So if you didn't already have wealth, if you didn't already come from a family that owned housing, it's very hard to get into housing. Now this, to bring it close to our community, I did want to just talk briefly about some studies that have been done, just giving you a depiction of, you know, what's occurring here. Now this was the housing study that was done in 2015, so it's now getting a little bit outdated, but we're seeing that the findings in this are really still true today. So one of the first findings is that Ann Arbor will become more costly and less affordable. We're certainly experiencing that today. The second one is that Ypsilanti will become more distressed, and we are actually finding that Ypsilanti, some of the housing cost is rising there too. There's kind of this trickle effect from Ann Arbor, but it's not increasing at the same rate as Ann Arbor. It's going much, much slower than the city of Ann Arbor. So there's two housing markets in this area. This finding shows that as housing increases, that people have to live outside of Ann Arbor. So that, you know, people are looking for places where they can afford a place, and then having to drive in a lot further to the city of Ann Arbor, because the city of Ann Arbor is still an employment center. And so this is really having an impact on our corridors, and this is increasing congestion and bringing it back to A20. This compromises our environmental quality. And then finally, this point I think is really significant, in that if we have a region that has a disparity like we're seeing here in the Ann Arbor region, where one place is very wealthy and the outskirts are not so wealthy, it really impacts everybody. The regions that grow together are more stable and typically more equitable and have less segregation and better balanced workforce skills. So that's what we're after. We want to figure out a way where we all grow together. So this, I don't know if many of you saw this when this was out and not underneath the snow and ice, but this was a mural that was painted outside around Carytown, or in Carytown, by artist Giannazzaro, and it's a map of Washtenaw County, and it highlights what segregation does, basically, and it's highlighting it through health. I mean, there's real impacts on our life expectancy based on where we live. And so this slide just gives a little bit more information about the map. So some of what the map tells us is that there's a 14-year difference between Black residents' average age of death in Ypsilanti, the city, versus Ann Arbor, Scioto, and York Townships. So that's 70 and 56 years respectively. I mean, that's significant. We're talking about lifespan. From 1970 to 2015 in Washtenaw County, the average age of death was 60 years for Hispanics and 76 years for white. There's a 16-year difference in life expectancy for Latino men between zip codes 48104, which is Ann Arbor, and 48198, favoring residents in Ann Arbor. So it's favoring the residents in the 48104, which is an Ann Arbor zip code. There is a 17-year difference between white residents' average age of death in Ypsilanti Township versus Chelsea Village. So 69 and 86 years respectively. So what can we do? This is the big question. First, there's the A20 strategies. But I contend we really need to put equity at the center of this. So in my lifetime as an urban planner, there's been basically three movements, I would say. The first one was the new urbanism, the fight against sprawl, which on the surface is great. This calls for is traditional neighborhood design, walkable, compact. But what ended up happening with this in practice is that these kind of developments occurred typically out in greenfield sites, and less urban areas, so they weren't very well connected. They're expensive, and they contributed to disinvestment in existing cities, especially legacy cities like Ypsilanti, these kind of core cities that have been around for a long time. The second one, economic development placemaking, again, on its surface seems great. What it calls for is public investment to spur private investment and creating identity and destination to attract investment. And you can see in the picture there, like, that place looks fun, it looks great, but basically what that ended up doing is creating these kind of playgrounds for wealthy people. So it was designed to draw knowledge workers, which are primarily college graduates. So it was this effort to draw wealth to your community. And that wasn't necessarily designed to help people who already lived in a community. It was meant to attract outside wealth. So here we are in the third movement, resiliency, sustainability. So this is, as you know, here to address climate change, handle shocks, and prepare for what's to come. And equity is said to be central to this, and I say we must live up to that. This movement, is going to set us back if we don't put equity at the center of it. So other ideas, these ideas came out of the writing. So the two books that I showed, in addition to other ideas that I've heard, one is to sell African Americans homes at lower prices that reflect lost generational wealth that could have been gained from family home ownership. Encourage real estate agents to help integrate neighborhoods. Change zoning, limit zoning powers. Have meaningful community engagement, seek underrepresented perspectives. Change capital improvement planning to invest in underserved areas. Establish a revenue sharing system between jurisdictions. That's easier said than done. A lot of jurisdictions don't like to work together. Engage in regional collaborative planning. And what else? So with that, I'll just end, I'll stop sharing my screen and just open it for questions. And I think we just have a few minutes for questions or any thoughts, if you have any other thoughts about what else we can do. Love to hear it.
Well, I won't let the camera go unused. And I am a member of the Economic Development Corporation for the city of Ann Arbor also. And we have been looking at affordable housing for the over 45,000 employees driving into Ann Arbor daily, working at the University of Michigan, the public schools, and the other, and Concordia College. They cannot afford a 2-bedroom home nor a 2-bedroom apartment. And if they can afford the house, they cannot afford to keep the house to meet code. So we've been looking at options and alternatives in terms of how can we provide housing. And one of the big things was the engagement of the local cities around Ann Arbor that has land, because that's the other problem in Ann Arbor. Unless you to build new ghettos, unless you build housing to instantly become ghettos, we need more land. And that is a critical part of why we're having such a difficult time with finding affordable land to build affordable housing. So I would definitely like to follow up with you in some form and look for EDC to look at how we can be more productive in encouraging some other options.
Yeah, absolutely. And a job that I had before this, my whole job was to help jurisdictions work together. So I love that idea of doing interjurisdictional collaboration to meet a regional need. Julie, I see you have your hand up.
Yeah, so I'm intrigued by this idea of selling homes at a lower price to African Americans who are purchasing homes. I'm just intrigued by this idea. I'm wondering if it has been done elsewhere, and was it successful, and where did the delta come from? Was it the cities investing or grant funding that invested in the delta, and how did that work?
I actually don't know of any examples. I'd love to, if anybody on this call happens to know of any examples, I'd love to hear about it, but I don't have any examples myself. All right, I see Brian, you have your hand up.
Okay, I'll go off mute and lower my hand. So I've been in favor of increasing density, increasing the amount of housing that gets built in not only Ann Arbor, but surrounding areas, as long as it's like walkable, all the rest of that, there's a quality of life aspect to it. But my concern has been the affordability question. You know, even people I've understood below the area median income, which for Washtenaw County is like 106,000, so you can just round it to 100,000, but can't afford new homes, new built homes, newly built, new construction. I found an organization, a nonprofit called the Neighborhood Assistance Corporation of America. They go by NACA for short. And they've gotten funding from the Bank of America to provide zero down payment, zero closing costs, reduced rate mortgages to those below the area median income. I've reached out to the University of Michigan. They like to work with the area's largest employers. So I haven't like gone broad scale with this. I've shared it with a few folks in the city. I think, Brett, you were on copy for one of those emails I sent. But I think it's wonderful. They have like 15 billion from Bank of America. So, you know, there has, wealth just doesn't occur on its own. You know, it's got to be generated over time. There's family to family wealth and housing that's, as you noted earlier, is was either constrained or taken away through various means from many communities. So I'm actually advocating NACA to come to the Washtenaw County area, Ann Arbor. I'm trying to get sponsorship first by the University of Michigan. If others are interested, I have a needs analysis paper I can share showing the trends of home ownership by household income levels over the past 10 years. It's been going down for those below 100,000 a year in income, household income. And it's been plummeting for those below 75,000 a year in household income. So the economic segregation is just, you know, getting worse in the past 10 years. There's the whole history of racism and discrimination. I know that's been in place, but it's been accelerating. So if anyone wants to reach out to me, I'll just quickly give you my email address, brchambers@comcast.net. And I'll share the paper. I don't see a chat box here anywhere, so otherwise I would have put it in chat.
Yeah, our chat is disabled on our city meetings, and that's to help with avoiding Open Meetings Act issues. But yeah, sorry about that. I know a lot of people like to write in comments.
So I'll stop here. brchambers@comcast.net. There's many people on the line here that I'm not familiar with. Hank and the Economic Development Corporation, I'd love to send it to you if you could send me your email, and anyone else here, just reach out to me. I've been revising it and updating it. I've had faculty on campus review it. I've had a number of other people who are active in the community review it and give me feedback. So once the university agrees to sponsor, I'm crossing my fingers. They sent my request into the HR organization through the associate VP's office, and then sent it over to the hospital HR organization, and they've been hammered by COVID and the current surge we're going through. So they want to talk to me. I've got a call at the end of the month. I said I'd stop here now. So thank you for hearing me.
Thank you, Brian. Then I see we have Michael and then Chris with hands up.
Yeah, I just wanted to briefly answer Julie's question about whether other communities have worked on providing housing to African Americans or other people of color as a form of reparations. And there's at least one city that I'm aware of. It's another Big Ten city, Evanston, Illinois. They have used the profits that they got from taxes from marijuana to form a fund to allow for the down payments on homes for Black families who can show that they had been discriminated against in Evanston. And of course, the idea is the forms of discrimination that Heather was talking about stripped Black people of wealth, stripped Black people and other people of color of opportunity. And this is a form of reparation. So it's not a huge program, but it's one example.
Thank you for sharing that. That's interesting. So using profits from marijuana sales for that. All right, Chris.
Yeah, my husband and I have lived in Ann Arbor for 50 years. And for 42 of those 50 years, we have lived in the downtown near Carytown. It's always been an expensive city. My husband and I are both teachers who worked our way through school because we both came from poor families. So we never had any generational wealth that was handed to us. But we scraped enough money together to buy a house, and we bought what was at that time the cheapest house we could find, which is where we still live. Now, the Carytown area is very sought after. There was a time when I told my students at Community High, people used to back away from me at parties and get-togethers for two reasons. Because I lived downtown, and also because I taught at Community High. I was looked at as really weird for both of those reasons. But now this is a very sought-after area. There are two things I want to tell you about something that's currently going on here. We have a situation where one of the former Community High students, his parents inherited a house here in Ann Arbor in this neighborhood, and they already had a house, so they just gave it to him. He is a craftsman. He does brickwork and stonework. Not a wealthy guy, but he's making a living. His taxes alone on house as an impediment to home ownership. Now, mind you, this is a guy who's in his 40s, and because his parents gifted him the house, he doesn't have a house payment, but he still pays $20,000 a year in property taxes, and this house is in really rough shape. He has been doing all the work on it to fix it up. Another point that I'd like to make is that here in the downtown, and by the way, part of the reason we bought here is I could walk to work at Community High. And that was really important to us because that lessened our transportation costs. We really had to look at how we spent our money, how we budgeted money. We may be white, but we have never been wealthy. And I talked to an owner of one of the Carytown businesses at Christmas time, and she said she wanted to live in this part of town, and she absolutely had to force realtors to show her a house in the downtown area. The realtors kept telling her that she didn't want to live here. And that's the same thing we heard too. When we have lived in this house now for 42 years, and 42 years ago, we were hearing from realtors that we really didn't want to live down here. And we were told about crime and all sorts of terrible reasons for living in the downtown. So who did they market these houses to? They market them to out-of-town investors who buy the houses and charge exorbitant rents. And we hear about this all the time. So there are other problems, institutional problems, beyond just racism. This is another kind of redlining, when you have the whole real estate community telling people decade after decade, you don't want to live there. And also when you have the city of Ann Arbor charging $20,000 on a ramshackle house. There are so many layers of problems that to focus on just one thing, it ignores the overall problem. And I think the city needs to address issues like some tax abatements to encourage people to live in certain areas. I can tell you that this neighborhood where I live is the most diverse neighborhood in terms of housing style and housing stock that exists in the whole city. We have rooming houses, we have apartment buildings, we have old houses that have been divided up into apartment buildings, and it's the most densely inhabited area of Ann Arbor, but the taxes are so exorbitant that anyone who wants to live in the general downtown area is really discouraged because they get a dump for which they have to pay really high taxes, or it is then marketed to wealthy, usually out-of-town developers. We have one person who owns 400 houses in the downtown, who owns probably 60 or more houses in the Old Fourth Ward Historic District. And every time he buys a house, he hikes the rent up because we hear about that all the time. And he's got the reputation for being a horrible landlord. But I bet you never hear his name. So there are lots of layers of problems. Racism is one of them. But there are other problems as well in terms of how Ann Arbor is being bought up by a lot of out-of-state interests, people with extreme, this includes out-of-country interests. There are people in the real estate community specializing in Middle East investment, specializing in Chinese investment, specializing in Russian investment. And then you have another added problem in that we have had some new construction in this neighborhood, but a lot of the houses have been, they're like football weekend houses. So even when you have an increase in the housing stock, if they're anywhere close to the university or close to the stadium, in other words, walkable houses, they get bought up by people, again, with very deep pockets who don't reside in the community, who use them just for vacation houses. So there are layers of problems that nobody is talking about.
Well, thank you, Chris. Yeah, you're right. The housing market is a very complex situation. You know that, and there's a lot of things contributing to the housing conditions in the city of Ann Arbor and access to housing. But for now, I think maybe we want to reserve time to move on to our main show and talk about racial covenants, which is what we're here to talk about tonight. So Galen, I guess I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you. Those questions, the Q&A was powerful. The presentation was powerful. Now I'm going to bring forth Ms. Joyce Hunter to introduce our panel.
So good evening, everyone. I'm Joyce Hunter, and I'm serving on the Justice and Deed Advisory Committee. And I will be introducing our panelists that will be sharing information and acting as my moderator. So when I read I'm going to read their bios, and the person I'm reading, if you could at least wave or put your hand up or something so people know where you're at. First, Susan Florent is working with Justice and Deed as a student attorney in the Civil Rights Litigation Initiative at the University of Michigan Law School. After graduating law school, Susan intends to practice disability rights law. Over the past 3 years, she has worked for the Minnesota Disability Law Center, Legal Services of South Central Michigan's Medical Legal Partnership, AARP Foundation, and the Network for Public Health Law. So where are you, Susan? Okay, great. Next, I'm going to do Justin Schell. Justin Schell is Director of the Design Lab, a peer and engaged learning community at the University of Michigan Library. His work in the lab revolves around facilitating learning and project development in areas such as publicly engaged scholarship, community and citizens science, accessibility and disability justice, media production, and more. Justin, where are you? Okay. All right, Michael J. Steinberg is a professor from practice at the University of Michigan Law School and the founding director of the Civil Rights Litigation Initiative at Michigan Law. Before becoming a law professor, Steinberg was the legal director of the ACLU of Michigan for 22 years, where he oversaw all ACLU litigation in the state. Professor Steinberg has litigated dozens of high-impact, high-profile cases on a wide variety of civil rights issues, including 6 cases that have reached the United States Supreme Court. Professor Steinberg and his students, working with many community and university leaders, recently founded Justice Indeed to not only raise awareness about racially restrictive covenants in Washington County, but also to take action to repeal them. Michael, where are you? Great. Okay, Bailey Sullivan. Bailey Sullivan is a second-year PhD student in the history of art at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, specializing in late medieval Northern European art. Her research focuses on the visual culture of physical and imaginative travel, most notably photography and cityscapes. To this end, she has been a collaborator on the Justice Indeed project since April 2021 and serves as a member of the Black Washington County Collaborator Group at the University of Michigan. And Bailey, where are you? Oh, there she is. Okay, great. And the next is Su Yuen Ru, is a writer and visual artist currently pursuing her PhD in the history of art. Her interests include modern and contemporary Asian art, decolonial thought, eco-criticism, performance studies, and socially engaged participatory practices. She has worked with Justice Indeed since April 2021 and is currently serving as a graduate student research assistant of the Black Washington County Collaborative. Where are you? So you. And that's our panel. So with that, we're going to start. Justin, are you going to be showing the PowerPoint?
Yep, I'll load it up right now.
So what we're going to do is we're going to start with Michael, and then whoever's next will just go ahead, introduce the next person and continue talking. Okay, Justin, is yours.
Mike's taking the first one.
Okay, very good.
Thank you very much, Joyce. You know, Ann Arbor, as you all know, has a reputation of being an enlightened place. But there is a perception among many of our residents that racial harmony exists in Ann Arbor. It has always existed in Ann Arbor, and to the extent that white supremacy and systemic racism exists, it's elsewhere in the state, elsewhere in the country. And you only need to look around your neighborhoods to see how, let me make sure I can do this. Can you all see the Black Lives Matter sign? Okay. To see the signs. This is from a year ago in my neighborhood on the west side of town. Everywhere you go, you would see these signs saying Black Lives Matter, racial justice is part of our home. I can get this to go. Whoops. You know, hate has no home here. All kinds of signs expressing our commitment to racial justice. But the truth is that hate does have a home here. In Ann Arbor, there are racially restrictive covenants on at least 10% of the homes in our city. And I'm gonna try this once. Well, never mind. You will see examples of racially restrictive covenants later in the presentation, but the one on my home says that only Caucasian people may live in my house unless they are servants or guests. And that is the most common type of covenant that exists in the city. Now, a racially restrictive covenant is a part of the deed or communal restrictions that prohibit people of certain races from buying or occupying a home. It's not limited to people of color. There are some that prohibit people from African or Jewish descent from living there. There's others, homes in Washtenaw County, that prevent so-called aliens from occupying certain homes unless they're from English-speaking countries. Racially restrictive covenants became common around 1919 after the US Supreme Court struck down racially restrictive zoning. And this was a device that was adopted to keep neighborhoods segregated. I first became aware of racially restrictive covenants when I bought my first house in Ann Arbor in 1986. I was a nerd and read through the closing packet and I saw it and I asked my real estate agent, what is this? I don't want to live in a house that has this restriction. And she said, oh, don't worry about it. It's not enforceable. There's lots of homes like it, and it's too expensive to do something about. And I said, okay, but I told myself that someday I would do something about it. And after coming to Michigan law and starting a civil rights clinic that did a lot of fair housing work, we decided as a clinic that we wanted to do more to raise awareness about discrimination in Ann Arbor and to counter the narrative that there's never been a problem with race discrimination in our city. And, you know, of course, racially restrictive covenants, as Heather was saying earlier, are not the only forms of discrimination. In our history, there's steering by real estate agents, there's mortgage lending, there are a myriad of other types of discrimination, but we thought that raising awareness about racially restrictive covenants would be very effective in educating people of Ann Arbor, because there's no better way to bring home the fact that white supremacy exists in our fair city than to show people that the very home that they live in has a racially restrictive covenant. We thought that it would be useful to help map the racially restrictive covenants in the city, as they did in Minneapolis and Seattle. And so we recruited people like Justin Schell and Rob Goodspeed, who have expertise in this, and they have developed a preliminary map, which you will see later. Some people, we thought, might question why we would focus on racially restrictive covenants when the Supreme Court ruled in 1948 that they were no longer enforceable and that they were made illegal in 1968 by the Fair Housing Act. And we talked about it for a long time. And we thought that for a number of reasons we would go forward. First of all, covenants cause real harm. Now, sure, they're not enforceable, but if a person of color moves into a neighborhood and reads the closing packet and says they're not welcome there, that causes harm. We see it as no different from there being a sign in the entrance to the subdivision that says whites only. It's not enforceable, but there's it's not right, and it shouldn't be in Ann Arbor. We also thought, of course, that education begins at home, and this created a great opportunity for education, and that policymakers should be aware of the history of housing discrimination in our city, because it should affect housing policy debates. And we didn't want the project to just be a law school project or a university project. So we have recruited some amazing civil rights leaders in Ann Arbor and throughout Washtenaw County to be part of our advisory board. Joyce is only one of them. Joyce is the director of the African American Cultural and Historical Society in Washtenaw County. And so we have this organization. It's called Justice Indeed. We're very proud of the name. We thought it was kind of catchy. And it has three major purposes. Number one, of course, is to expose the fact that racially restrictive covenants exist. Number two, it's discussed, is to educate the community and policymakers about the existence of racially restrictive covenants, which still exist in Ann Arbor. And lastly, to eliminate them, to repeal them through one of three ways: community organizing, organizing neighborhoods, and Susan's going to talk more about that later. Through legislation, we're providing technical support to a representative who has introduced bills to make it easier to repeal and replace racially restrictive covenants, and also through litigation. It's very exciting, groundbreaking work, and we have a great group. We're willing to work with neighborhood associations, as you'll hear, if there are racially restrictive covenants in your neighborhood. But I'm gonna, I think, hand it to Justin, right? Justin's
Yep.
gonna talk about the mapping, which is really fascinating.
Thanks, Mike. Can everybody see the Justice Indeed logo on it? Cool. Okay, thank you. As Joyce mentioned, I'm Justin Schell from the University of Michigan Library, and I'll briefly talk about some work we've already done about racial covenants in Washtenaw County, and this method that we used to look at the subdivision level, and then also where we're going to go next at the individual property level. And so from looking at covenants through a partnership with Liberty Title and looking at the subdivision level, our method was, and this was a lot of work from Rob Goodspeed, who's in the urban planning department, as well as Grace Stephen, an undergraduate, who went through a lot of documents and found where covenants had been blacked out in the Liberty Title documents, and then took those documents and traced them back through the Washtenaw County system. And so in this time frame from 1912 to 1952, we found approximately 121 plats or subdivisions that have racially restrictive covenants. And I'll just pop this map in here. And so anytime you see a color, that's some sort of covenant. And so we see them throughout. We also see them further out in different parts of the county. And so some of them, are concentrated in areas. Some are pretty, spread out. But we can see, for instance, Darlington number 1 had a covenant recorded in 1925, and things like that. So this is on our website. This link is on our website, and so you could see that as at your own convenience. See, oops, and so we broke these down to when these covenants were from. So the vast majority of these were from the 1920s, which were a result of Supreme Court decisions that allowed these documents to be used. And to reach back to Heather's presentation, the Color of Law book goes into this in great detail. And so 109 of them limit the sale or use of the property to Caucasian or white people only. And then 12 restrict the sale or use of property to colored or African people. We know that there are other subdivisions that have racially restrictive covenants. We found there was one, actually we'll talk about in a little bit, we missed because they used whiteout instead of like a black redaction. And so we know there are others, but this is just our first pass, and we will keep updating this map as we find out more of these on a subdivision level. And so some examples this is one from University Heights and Ravenna Heights. No persons or any race other than the Caucasian race shall use or occupy any building or any lot except that this covenant shall not prevent occupancy of domestic servants of a different race or different race domiciled with an owner or tenant. And then one from Killens Heights from 1916. Said premises shall at no time be used or occupied for manufacturing purposes, nor by a colored person or persons for any purpose. If you see these documents, these are often in a long list of restrictions about what can be done on the property. And so this was just one of many restrictions that were placed. But generally, it was only for people of color were they named in there as people who could not occupy the land. And you can see again on the map, we have when you click on a plat or a subdivision, you can see the text of the covenant in each one. And so in looking at this map, we can see that 11% of parcels surveyed in Ann Arbor. So these subdivisions that have covenants in them represent 11% of parcels surveyed. And so that means that 11% of parcels have racially restrictive covenants. And so this is where we that number that Mike mentioned earlier, more than 10% of houses or properties have a racially restrictive covenant. Again, this map is on our website, and you can see that. And we hope that this map will only get more detailed as we move forward with this project. So again, we see this map here, and one of the things we'd like to do is move towards the individual level of this, where people have been sending us their individual deeds, said, oh, I found, much like Mike's house, like, oh, this has a covenant on it, like send it to us and we can parse it and figure out, what's the history and things like that. And they often ask us what can be done about it, which we'll talk about a little later. But we're also hoping to partner with a larger project that has used crowdsourcing to identify covenants on an individual housing and deed level. And so keep an eye out for that, and keep an eye out on our website. We also can, you can join a mailing list and things like that to keep abreast of that. We're also part of a national coalition of people working on this in Minneapolis and St. Paul, DC, St. Louis, San Francisco, Seattle, LA, all over the country who are working on this because it's been a hard thing, because they've been often been so idiosyncratic in their uses and in their deployments. And so this is something where we can learn from the expertise from other communities and share out what we've learned as part of our work here. And so from that, I will pass it over to Susan to talk about the Hannah Subdivision project.
Thanks so much, Justin. Hi, everyone. I'm Susan Fleurant, and I'm a student attorney with the Civil Rights Litigation Initiative, working with Mike over at the law school. And I wanted to share, we're really thrilled that our organizing efforts are underway here in Ann Arbor. And so I'll share about the Hannah Subdivision and our work with them and hope to inspire many of you to undertake similar efforts in your neighborhoods. So the Hannah subdivision has a communal restriction that was recorded in 1947. It's here on the screen. It's very similar to one of the examples that Justin just shared. And this is a communal restriction, so it's recorded in the communal documents governing the entire community. Like Mike said, and like Justin said, these aren't enforceable any longer, but they do continue to exist in these documents and continue to cause harm, foster exclusion, and signal animosity toward non-white residents and potential buyers. But in Hannah, the communal restrictions also provide a mechanism by which the homeowners can repeal covenants. And in this example in Hannah, the covenant may be repealed by a majority vote of the homeowners in the neighborhood. And so that's where the community organizing comes in. And Justin, you can advance to the next slide. And so what are we doing? So we've put together an amendment document drafted by the Civil Rights Litigation Initiative in partnership with a handful of others. And this is just a snippet of it, but in before this part of the amendment, it contains provisions which serve to educate about the history of racially restrictive covenants and repudiate the racially restrictive covenant. And then here's the replacement language, and it says, the Hannah subdivision seeks to be an inclusive community that welcomes and celebrates diversity. The sale or occupancy of any lot or dwelling shall not be restricted based on religion, race, color, national origin, disability, age, sex, height, weight, familial status, marital status, sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, military status, or source of income. So clearly this goes far beyond race. And like Mike said, racially restrictive covenants in general were used against various groups in history. And it was important for us and for the Hannah subdivision to make an affirmative statement incorporating protections from local, state, and federal law that really reflects their values today and what they want to present as a community. And so we're currently working with an organizing committee of residents to educate and organize neighbors. And we'll begin collecting signatures on the amendment document very soon, which is very exciting for all of us. And the signed amendment will then be filed with the Register of Deeds office to effectuate the repeal and replacement. Like I said, Hannah is one of the first neighborhoods that we're working with, but we plan to work with others. And we're hoping to develop a toolkit so that other neighborhoods can replicate the process, and we can serve as technical advisors and provide some assistance if needed. And we're also hoping to streamline the process for individual homeowners as well as we go along. So still in the early stages of this work, but really excited about the Hannah subdivision, really grateful for their energy and partnership in this and for their willingness to serve as a model for other neighborhoods. So with that, I will turn it over, but thanks so much.
Thank you, Susan. I'm going to go next. I mentioned when I did the introduction that I'm on the advisory committee for Justice Indeed, but the way we are doing our work is also through committees. And we have 3 committees. I'm going to tell you a little bit about those committees. The policy committee is chaired by Defia Simpson and Jessica Lataw. The policy committee seeks to ensure that elected officials consider the legacy of racially restrictive covenants and other racist housing policies when adopting housing policies. The committee also explores possible ways to repeal racially restrictive covenants through community organizing, legislation, and litigation. All right, the Education Committee is chaired by myself. The Education Committee creates and shares content on racially restrictive covenants and the history of segregated housing in Washtenaw County through curriculum, museum exhibits, and online presentations. The last committee is the History Committee, which is chaired by Matthew Countryman. The History Committee documents the use of racially restrictive covenants, other racist housing policies in Washtenaw County, and the causes of residential segregation in the county. Those are our three committees: policy, education, and history. Now it goes back to Justin.
It goes to Bailey now.
Okay, thank you, Bailey.
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Bailey. As Joyce mentioned, I'm a PhD student in the history of art at the University of Michigan. And I'm here to introduce the Black Washtenaw County, which is a project that grew directly out of Justice Indeed in spring and summer of 2021. The group applied for and received a grant from the Michigan Humanities Collaboratory in the summer of 2021 to fund a 2-year-long interdisciplinary project revolving around the intersecting histories of African-American community building and racial segregation in Washtenaw County during the 20th and early 21st centuries. So the BWC, as we like to call it, builds upon 3 existing entities. It builds upon the African-American Cultural and Historical Museum of Washtenaw County, which is led by Joyce. The Summer 2021 Michigan in the World Project, which is a public history project led by Dr. Jennifer Jones, who is Assistant Professor of History and Women's and Gender Studies at the University of Michigan, and Justice Indeed. So what are we doing in the BWC here? We hope to foster a greater understanding of Black experience in Washtenaw County, again, over the 20th and 21st centuries, with a particular focus on post-1945 history. We want to understand how local histories may align with, challenge, or complicate national histories about Black culture. We also want to center community campus collaboration with a campus team that includes myself, among others, and community collaborators that include the African American Cultural and Historical Museum, Justice Indeed, of course, Jessica Lataw, who is Executive Director of Building Matters Ann Arbor, and Yodit Johnson, who is CEO of nonprofit Enterprise at Work, Ypsilanti-based historian Matthew Siegfried, designer Charlene Hobbs, and others. So we've got a very large team working on this project. We also, kind of generally speaking, want to conduct research and collect information. And we do this by recording oral histories, researching primary archival materials, locating secondary resources that pertain to racial inclusion and exclusion in Ann Arbor and Ypsilanti in particular, and hopefully to expand to Washtenaw County in general. We hope to make these collected resources available to public audiences, hopefully electronically through exhibitions and possibly in a public art project. So we kind of essentially are connecting and building on a host of efforts that are already underway. We hope to make them more prominent and accessible in the communities of the county and more broadly. And I'm going to turn it over to So Yoon, and I believe, Justin, if you could advance to the next slide. Awesome.
Thank you, Bailey. My name is Soyun Ryu, and I've been working with the BWC and Justice Indeed as a graduate student research assistant. I wanted to briefly introduce one facet of the work that BWC is doing in conjunction with the Justice Indeed's legal dimension that aligns closely with one of all of our education and public scholarship initiatives. So Bailey Sullivan, who just spoke, and Dr. Claire Zimmerman, Charlene Hobbs, and myself were part of the working group entitled Race in Arts and the Built Environment. And we are looking at the interlocking histories of racial segregation and Black and people of color community formation simultaneously, specifically through the visual and architectural lenses. So far, our research has roughly 4 nodes, and the first node is on the slide that you see now. This consists of a historical research of residential segregation in Washington County, and we are currently looking at archival and oral history materials of a number of developments that were historically either officially segregated or de facto segregated, and also the developments that were reserved for African-American workers and communities. So these properties include the Pittsfield Village in Ann Arbor, Willow Run Village, and Park Ridge Homes in Ypsilanti. Justin, if you could go to the next slide, that'd be great. We're also looking at how these residential histories are very tightly intertwined with industrial development in Detroit and its vicinity. So for example, the image that you see on the left, the Willow Run Village, and the image on the right, Park Ridge and Ypsilanti, they were built during the Second World War and provided temporary worker housing for workers at the Ford Bomber plant. Both were worker housings, but our research shows that Willow Run Village could be conceived as a de facto white-only space, whereas Park Ridge served as the housing for Black workers of the same plant. So our working group is taking a wide scope on various modes of residential segregation and looking at how these histories of the developments, and of course, as Heather mentioned, the more recent urban renewal, how they're continuing to shape the neighborhood that we live in today. Justin, if you could go to the next slide. Our third node is taking a look at histories, not only taking a look at histories of the residential segregation, but also paying equal attention to how such histories, in fact, tend to overshadow a very robust set of creative activities of Black artists and practitioners at Washington County. So we're researching works by very prominent Black artists active in the county, who used to be active in the county, including Harold Neal and Charles McGee, and how the works they created are very firmly grounded in locally specific experiences of living in Washington County, and how their works are very well nested into the fabric of our neighborhood today. So for instance, we see quite a lot of public artworks left by Charles McGee and other important artists throughout Ann Arbor and Ypsi. And that includes the mural that Heather introduced to us in the beginning. So we're hoping to document these works moving forward. If you could go to the next slide. Thank you, Justin. And lastly, really briefly, we are exploring the possibilities of seeking these histories close relevance at the present moment. And we're hoping to initiate some of the community-based participatory art practices with artists and residents of the county moving forward. Yeah, so that's what we're doing in our working group and the BWC in general. We're at a very early stage as of now, but it has been a very exciting process to see how public humanities and arts intersect with justice and deed research, mapping, and litigation practices. So how each node of our project informs one another, I think, is a really fascinating asset moving forward. I will end here and hand it over to Joyce. Thank you very much.
Okay, so thank you to our panelists. And I also want to say thank you for allowing us to come and present and share this information. At this time, we can open it up for Q&A if anybody has any questions.
I have a question about the art exhibits. At our church, we often will have an exhibit in our social hall for people to observe. If there's something available like that that we could feature at our church sometime, I would really be interested in following up on that.
So the African American Culture and Historical Museum, we just opened to the public on October 24th. And we featured, that last slide showed you some of the artwork, and we featured 5 artists in that for that exhibit. So that's one option for you. So if you want to contact me, I can give you more information.
Okay, yeah, there are people from our church who would not necessarily go to see those exhibits, would see them at our church. And that would be a good educational opportunity, I think. Yeah, so,
Okay, and I certainly will. We can connect, and also we have a collections committee, and we can kind of coordinate that for you.
okay.
Brian, did you have a question?
Just a quick one. What was the characterization of Pittsfield Village? Again, I heard it briefly there and it went by me so fast, I didn't understand the context. Was it in the
Yeah.
last presentation? Thank you, Soo-Young.
We're in a very early stage of researching the Pittsfield Village, but we are working around one image we found at the Ann Arbor District Library, which is a 1962 march against the housing discrimination at Pittsfield Village. And the management actively denied any existence of racial discrimination, but we are in the process of figuring out how, among various legal forces of discrimination, there were also de facto and more, say, visual operations of segregation taking place, for instance, in publicity materials or in the newspaper ads or some other phrasings used to publicize Pittsfield Village as a contained community, for instance. Yeah, so we are in a very early stage, and I think it's quite early for us to call it a segregated housing, but we're working under the assumption that this was de facto segregation. Thank you.
Thank you, Liz. Sorry, I'm mute.
Other questions? If not, I need to turn it back over to who?
Yeah, let me just, if
Michael, go
and
ahead, Michael.
catch the website, it's simply Justice Indeed MI for Michigan, so justiceindeedmi.org. And you can go on there to check out the interactive maps, a lot of the documentation that we've been working with. And you can also email us. If you want to volunteer, if your neighborhood has a racially restrictive covenant and you would like us to work with you to repeal and replace it, I think that's the best place to go. So justiceindeedmi.org.
Thank you, Michael. Okay, that concludes our presentation. I'm not sure who picks it up at this point, but whoever that is, I'm turning it back over to you.
Thank you all for coming out this evening. Today's presentation shows us that we got a lot of work to do. I mean, racism is like an onion, keep peeling back layers and layers and layers. Some of us who've experienced it, no, but those of you who, haven't felt it or seen it, it might be new to you, but just understand that, it still exists and the fight continues. So this evening, I want to thank everybody for coming out. I want to thank Heather Sapert, the presenters from Justice Indeed. Thank you all. Our next Neighborhood Associations meeting will be in March, and we'll be talking about pollinators because it'll be planting season. So thank you all for coming out this evening, and have a great evening. Thank you.
Good night.